Now, diplomacy is cut off and there are no foreigners. Looking at the world situation, it is far from the 2021 Tokyo Olympics. Yet, this infectious disease is often unknown due to a mysterious phenomenon. Now, the Crisis Management Office of Telepath Psychokinesis Countermeasure R&D Strategy Center, Telepath Psychokinesis Central Intelligence Agency is rushing to identify the cause of this psychic phenomenon. Pneumonia. I tried to verify this globally. In developed countries such as the United States, it accounts for 10% of all deaths on an annual basis. This is about 300,000 people a year in the United States. Since there are 30,000 people a month to 1,000 people are confirmed dead per day. At the planetary level, on an annual basis, about 4 million of all deaths die from pneumonia. That's 10,000 people a day. With exceptions, it is estimated that almost all are older than 80 years old. The number of deaths tested and certified as a new type of corovirus infection at the world level will reach 1 million in 10 months. Converting this to 100,000 people per month. The number of deaths does not increase exponentially, but tends to remain at the same level. 3,000 people die from the new corovirus infection per day. However, this value is for the case where the cause of death of the corpse is identified. Therefore, the effects of the new coronavirus infection may increase if we include the number of people who actually died of pneumonia and other diseases such as cancer associated with the virus, stroke, and myocardial infarction. The bottom line is that most are dead at the end of their lives. The main cause is a condition such as immunodeficiency. Pneumonia syndrome becomes a secondary problem. The conclusion is that no one is infected, except for the elderly. Rather, most infected people are asymptomatic, and only 1% have dyspnea at the level of ambulance. The biggest mystery is why healthy people have dyspnea symptoms regardless of the immune system. And he continues to live while suffering to the extent that he does not die. Fewer people study in situations where they do not know when they will become severe or die from another disease. And people will not only come into contact with people but also move and act to move due to cardiovascular disorders that reduce their athletic ability. Quit. Infection from mucosal contact and saliva causes problems with heterosexual relationships. There is a problem with the sales of izakaya and sex shops. And the issue of sexual desire processing is the biggest issue for men. Modern science cannot explain why airway, bronchi, and lung pain continue, even if it is not dyspnea, and why it repeats pathological and asymptomatic conditions on an hourly basis. In other words, even if infected, the immune system does not work normally. Therefore, there is no fever after infection. I don't know if the real pathogen is a virus, but it's a fact that something causes acute pneumonia. The outbreak of the new corovirus infection is in the Japanese archipelago. Since China used Japan as a tourist destination, it believes that the Chinese were only the first to confirm the existence of the disease. In other words, the large number of Chinese visited Japan for sightseeing, study abroad, and work. Japan has lost its status as an industrial nation and has become a tourist destination for foreigners, just like Southeast Asian countries. At that time, many whites and other races visited Tokyo as well as Chinese. Now, diplomacy is cut off and there are no foreigners. Looking at the world situation, it is far from the 2021 Tokyo Olympics. Yet, this infectious disease is often unknown due to a mysterious phenomenon. Now, the Crisis Management Office of the Research and Development Strategy Center for Countermeasures Against Sattrail is rushing to identify the cause of this psychic phenomenon.
The future is unpredictable, but it is always perceived by something. Something that is not human. I don't believe in gods and Buddhas, but there are things in this world that have an invisible consciousness. that deliberately manipulate and cause all kinds of phenomena. The Japanese people know this, but no one talks about it publicly or through their acquaintances, and it seems to me that a group of people enjoy the psychic ability to hear, sense, or see the mind of others, a sixth sense. Modern science can't even speculate on who or what is causing this. Rather, it's now a religious concept. China was the first to announce COVID-19 acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, but it may have merely been the first to find it. In other words, it's a symptom of viral pneumonia, a high-frequency outbreak in human history. Symptoms of pneumonia also include multiple coronaviruses. The Japanese press is reporting only the number of new infections and deaths, but no details are available. This is likely to be the same condition in all mouths. They just say that in general, people with underlying diseases such as diabetes and the elderly are more likely to become seriously ill. There seems to be a tacit understanding of the situation of asymptomatic infected and mildly ill people, and there are restrictions on the reporting of such cases. In recent years, there has been a great variety of natural disasters in Japan. Although people say we will never forget as a slogan, the reality is that the same thing will never happen again to anyone alive today while they are still alive. I can only assume that someone has decided to make it that way. For example, the next time a major earthquake happens, your child becomes an adult, a child is born, and then dies in his or her lifetime, and then the child dies in his or her lifetime. And then after about 1,000 years of this, that is, only recorded as an archaeological site like the Egyptian pyramids, when everyone has forgotten about it. In the form of a sudden and calamitous disaster caused by someone perceiving the. But when it comes to this COVID-19, there is no end to the inexplicable. The 24-hour cycle of the day repeats every day, with periods of time that are asymptomatic and periods of time that are symptomatic. I feel that this is a switching point for my internal clock's sleep time. The asymptomatic state begins every morning when you wake up. This is a phenomenon not seen in any infectious disease experienced in human history. With the flu virus, a young, healthy person will often spontaneously heal within a week or so after infection due to fever and immune activation. In the case of HIV, there are cold-like symptoms after infection, but they quickly go into an incubation period and become asymptomatic for many years, and finally die from the development of pneumonia and malignancy due to immune deficiency. Viruses such as the common cold, as well as other diseases, can cause continuous morbidity once they occur. This is because the body's tissues and organs are inflamed and destroyed at the cellular level. In the case of herpes, once infected, the disease hides in nerve cells such as ganglia and is undetectable. And there are periods of time during a person's life when they are asymptomatic and periods of symptoms. However, even in the case of herpes, when symptoms are present, there is a certain period of continuous morbidity. However, the newer coroviruses are subject to repeated reactivation and incubation on an hourly basis. This is the reason why it is full of asymptomatic infected people. In other words, a person can be asymptomatic if they remain asymptomatic continuously from the time they wake up until they sleep at night. However, if you are asymptomatic for only a few hours after waking up, you may have symptoms such as pneumonia or gastritis for 8 or more hours until you fall asleep. The duration of these symptoms also varies from person to person. Also, if the virus is latent, no genes or antigens will be detected in the blood test even if the person is infected. There is no way to know when the virus is multiplying. This means that current tests are not nearly as accurate as they could be. Some people may not have been infected yet, but we believe the number of cases that have been published is just the tip of the iceberg. For those with mild cases, life is the worst possible scenario with no known cure or cause. In other words, they are erased from society by quarantine measures. I studied molecular biology and chemistry, so I don't believe in gods, Buddhas and ghosts, but there are some unusual phenomena in the human nervous system that cannot be explained by science. In other words, it's like an evil spirit. Invisible to the eye, this world is in a state of psychic phenomenon. There is something in the world. Until the beginning of the 20th century, human beings used to kill each other frequently in wars, but even in such an environment, as long as a country was economically rich, people were able to live their daily lives. However, it is no longer possible to return to such a normal life in the future. Now, the cause of the worst infectious disease in human history is the new corovirus SARS-CoV-2. The scientists have announced that this is the case. So, assuming that this is true, I decided to find out what the asymptomatic infected people are. I will give my opinion on what the asymptomatic infected people are that cause it. I then summarized the causal relationship between acute severe pneumonia and aging among infectious diseases. To put it simply, 100 years ago, humans, unaware of the existence of the virus, inoculated the human body with a vaccine against bacteria taken from a patient and found it to be therapeutically effective. That's what was reported then, so we're in the same situation today. So we don't actually know what the pathogen is. Biologically speaking, it's not just coronaviruses, but multiple microbes, viruses, and unknown objects and organisms, most of which are hiding and multiplying inside the human body, especially inside cells. In view of the high frequency of asymptomatic genetic mutations caused by careless cross-species transmission between animals of different species, humanity today is at a fundamentally ignorant and meaningless intellectual level with respect to life sciences. This is because there are still many facts that cannot be explained by modern science, yet we know nothing about them even if we knew they were there. Therefore, do the drugs and vaccines for infectious diseases that are being deployed on a global level also work or not? I'm not sure what the research data is about. So what I can say now is that we are talking about a rough hypothesis based on actual experience and exposure. To understand what it means to be asymptomatic, it is first necessary to explain what antibodies are. In humans, there are 5 main types of antibodies, IgM, IgD, IgA and IgE, which are called antibody isotypes. The isotype is determined by the H chain. More research is being done on antibodies, but not all of their functions are yet known. IgG is the most common antibody in the blood. They all have a mechanism that allows them to take various forms acquired from antibody-producing cells through accidental recombination of genes, allowing them to recognize self and foreign substances. IgD is present on the surface of B cells and is involved in the induction of antibody production. However, we know nothing about its detailed mechanism. The variety of antibodies is, probabilistically speaking, almost infinite. In other words, they are able to bind to any foreign substance, thus triggering the immune system function in the body. This is the basic process required for the early stages of immunity. After that, it is very complex and involves a large number of cells and protein groups interacting with each other. Function of the immune system drawing in English. Microorganisms, such as bacteria and viruses, bind part of their own structure to the surface of the cell as the first step. They then enter the cell. They bind antibodies to the parts of the cell that they bind when they enter the cell. Antibodies to spike proteins reduce the infectivity of influenza because the influenza virus binds spike proteins on the surface of the virus to sialic acid residues on airway epithelial cells and enters the cells. This is called a neutralizing effect. On the surface of the flu virus, a glycoprotein called spike protein protrudes from the surface of the flu virus. According to modern science, this glycoprotein has a part called the receptor binding domain, which is involved in binding on the surface of human cells. Neutralizing antibodies are based on medical knowledge that the receptor binding domain is necessary for cell invasion. So antibodies in this part of the protein can inhibit the toxicity of the pathogen. In hive infection, even when hive-specific antibodies are induced, Hive-specific neutralizing antibodies are known to be less efficient at inducing hive-specific neutralizing antibodies. This is thought to be due to the high frequency of genetic mutations during growth in the body, as well as the immediate change in surface structure due to glycosylation by the modifying action of proteins. At this stage of the hypothesis, the receptor binding domain of the virus, receptor binding motif (RBM), should change considerably in steric structure when mutations and protein modification actions are added. This affects its infectivity, and it is likely to be related to the binding of antibodies. In particular, it is not known which enzymes are involved in the modification of glycosylation, and the mechanism of glycosylation is unknown. The mechanism of action for glycosylation is also unknown. It is common for only one domain to be on top, but sometimes all of the domains are tucked into a glycan or amino acid sequence, and sometimes multiple domains are out in the open. The outward placement of the viral binding domains is necessary for the virus to bind strongly to the cell's receptors. This flexibility is very advantageous for the virus. In other words, in the case of the new corovirus SARS-CoV-2, it often binds very strongly to the ACE2 protein, which is specifically expressed in the lungs and airways. It has been named SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, because of the pathological symptoms it causes. However, if the binding domain is structurally hidden, it is thought to be growing in other cells. In addition, the rare sign domain portion of this hidden case is only exposed when a receptor or antibody binds to it. The binding power between molecules should be low. Nothing has been done to determine whether the duration of incubation in the gene state in the cell without proliferation depends on the cell type. Recent mutant SARS is highly malignant because the receptor binding domain is particularly flexible in this receptor binding domain. This means that it may cause them to be able to grow without morbidity. Coronavirus RNA encodes 6 proteins: pages 1A, pages 1AB, spike glycoprotein, envelope, membrane glycoprotein, and nucleocapsid protein. First, we performed a whole genome analysis of the genes encoding these proteins, looking for sequences that influenced differences in pathogenicity. In addition, research data related to pathogenicity suggest that the proteins encoded by the genetic regions involved in disease pathogenesis are pages 1AB, peptides NSP3, NSP4, and NSP14, spike glycoproteins, membrane glycoproteins, and nucleocapsid proteins. The insertions, deletions, and replacements of nucleocapsid proteins in the highly lethal coronaviruses were concentrated in nuclear localization signals, 2 single-nodal nuclear localization signals and 1 twin-nodal nuclear localization signal, and in nuclear extravasation signals. In other words, they are involved in the processes required for the virus to grow in the cell. The 2 main mononodal nuclear localization signals were positively charged. In coronaviruses, nucleocapsid proteins have been reported to be localized in the nucleus, especially in the nucleolus. In coronaviruses, it has been suggested that this localization to the cell nucleus is associated with increased pathogenicity. In other words, it is speculated that pathogenicity is induced by genetic differences in the binding and intracellular proliferation of spiking proteins at the genetic level. Angiotensin-converting enzyme 2, ACE2, a viral receptor in human cells, is a protein that is essential, in short, for the maintenance of homeostasis in the organism. As both ACE and ACE2 are renin-angiotensin systems, regulate blood pressure and blood flow in multiple organs, including the lungs, heart and kidneys. It cannot be inhibited. Next, we looked at the number of deaths from pneumonia from the past to the present. The number of people who die from pneumonia, 7%, in Japan is 70,000 per year. This is 7,000 cases per month, or 600 per day, all of whom are over 80 years old. There have been no deaths per day from newer coronavirus infections that have been attributed to the cause of the newer coronavirus, because the newer coronaviruses have been detected by testing. The number of non-fatal cases of pneumonia is also estimated to be about 10 times as high as the number of deaths per day, which is estimated to be as high as 6,000 per day. All of them are elderly people. Hospitals do not conduct detailed tests, and the cause of pneumonia is unknown, either from an unknown viral cause or from a bacterial cause. This has been examined globally. In developed countries such as the United States, it accounts for 10% of all deaths on an annual basis. This translates to about 300,000 per year in the United States. 30,000 per month, so 1,000 deaths per day are confirmed. On a planetary level, on an annual basis, about 4 million of all deaths are due to pneumonia. This works out to 10,000 per day. Apart from exceptions, it is estimated that almost all of them are aged 80 years or older. The number of deaths that have been tested and certified as new corovirus infections on a global level would be 1 million in 10 months. This trend 100,000 deaths per month, and the number of deaths is not rising exponentially, but tends to remain at the same level. On a daily basis, the number of people who die from newer corovirus infections is 3,000. However, this figure is based on the cause of death of the corpses. Therefore, the impact of the new corovirus infection may actually increase if the number of deaths from pneumonia and other illnesses such as associated cancer, stroke, and myocardial infarction are included. As it turns out, the majority of people die in their lifetime. The primary cause is due to conditions such as immune deficiency. Pneumonia syndrome is a secondary problem. The conclusion is that none of the infected people, except for the elderly, become seriously ill. Instead, the majority of infected people are asymptomatic, with only 1% having symptoms such as difficulty breathing that require emergency medical attention. The biggest mystery is why healthy people have respiratory distress independent of their immune systems. And they continue to suffer and live on to the point of not dying. Fewer and fewer people study with the uncertainty of when they will become seriously ill or die from another disease. And people quit moving and being active as well as contacting people with reduced mobility from circulatory disorders. Problems arise in heterosexual relationships because the disease is transmitted through mucosal contact and saliva. There are problems in the operation of taverns and sex shops, and for men, the challenge of handling sexual desire is the biggest challenge for mankind. Modern science is unable to explain the cause of continuous pain in the airways, bronchial tubes, and lungs, even when not in a state of respiratory distress, and the cause of repeated morbid and asymptomatic states on an hourly basis. In other words, the immune system is not working properly after infection. Therefore, there is no fever after infection. We do not even know if the real pathogen is a virus, but it is a fact that something can cause acute pneumonia. The Japanese islands are the site of the new corovirus infection. China believes that the Chinese were only the first to confirm the existence of the disease because they had turned the country into a tourist destination. In other words, large numbers of Chinese were coming to Japan for tourism, study and work. Japan had lost its industrial status and had become a tourist destination for foreigners, just like the countries of Southeast Asia. At that time, Tokyo was not only visited by Chinese, but also by a large number of Caucasians and other ethnic groups. Now, diplomatic relations have been cut off and there's in the sea. Looking at the state of the world, this is no longer the 2021 Tokyo Olympics. Still, there is much that remains to be learned about this mysterious and baffling phenomenon. Right now, the Crisis Management Office of the Telepath Psychokinesis Countermeasure R&D Strategy Center, Telepath Psychokinesis Central Intelligence Agency, Countermeasures Research and Development Strategy Center is trying to figure out the cause of this psychic phenomenon in a hurry.